What's up, everyone? Welcome into DodgerHeads, presented by DodgerBlue.com, part of the Blue Wire Podcast Network. My name is Jeff Spiegel. Special guest joining us today, Erik Sherman, author of a book that came out last year, Daybreak at Chavez Ravine, Fernandomania, and the Remaking of the Los Angeles Dodgers. Erik, I appreciate you joining us. I shared right before we hopped on, as a Dodgers fan that was born at the end of the 1980s, I loved this book, so thank you for writing it.
Oh, well, my pleasure. It sounds like this book was written for fans like you in mind.
Yeah, no, I bet it. I'll be curious to see as we post this and as people interact with this show, kind of the feedback that we get. But I'm sure it's going to hit a number of different levels for people that lived it and get to relive it through your book, or people that maybe didn't catch the significance the first time around. And so, before we get into Fernando and his story and the way that you frame it in this book, I always love to ask authors, like, how did this book come about? What was you're a New York guy. You've written a bunch of different baseball books. You're a baseball historian. What was it about Fernando and this story that kind of drew you in?
Well, first of all, I couldn't believe that a book had not been written about Fernando Valenzuela's life, and not just his life, but the impact, not just on baseball, but on society.
Yeah.
I always tell people that the true impactful story of Fernando didn't begin in 1981 with Fernandomania. It didn't even begin when he was born in 1960. It really began back in the early 50s, when um, the residents of Chavez Ravine were being asked to sell their homes,
Yeah.
being asked to leave. So on Chavez Ravine, they could build affordable housing, which they felt through eminent domain in the city would be the greater good. These poor residents, through eminent domain, were forced to leave. Now, through the Red Scare, which occurred around 1953, that affordable housing plan was halted. The Red Scare, it made it seem like, well, this is at worst a communist endeavor and at best a socialist endeavor. So the Mexican Americans that remained in their homes felt, okay, well, we're in the clear now. And then the Brooklyn Dodgers were looking for a new home, and they were lured out to Los Angeles with the promise of this beautiful 300-acre piece of property in Chavez Ravine. And the remaining residents, the Mexican American residents, were forced to leave. Some of them forcibly, the ones that didn't want to sell. So you can imagine, for the next 2 decades,
Yeah.
Southern Californian Latinos were not Dodger fans. And of course, that all changed with Fernando. So it's just such a compelling story.
Yeah.
But there is a reason, I believe, that it wasn't written before. Do you want to hear it?
Let's hear it.
Okay. Fernando Valenzuela never wanted to write a book.
Yeah.
Never wanted to be interviewed for any potential books on the subject. So why would I do it? So I remembered one of the great long form essays ever written by Gay Talese back in 1966. It was entitled "Frank Sinatra Has a Cold." And Frank Sinatra did not want to cooperate with Gay Talese on the piece. It ran in Esquire, and I guess Frank had an issue with that magazine, maybe for something they had written about him in the past. So what Gay Talese did was he interviewed dozens and dozens of people inside and outside of Frank Sinatra's inner circle. And he was able to piece together, like I said, one of the great long form stories in journalism history. So I kind of took that as inspiration, and that's what I did. I interviewed some of his closest friends, colleagues, and those greatly impacted um, by his life and career.
Did you actually, I mean, you kind of told the story, like Fernando has not written a biography, he's turned down movie deals. Did you approach Fernando about being involved and did he turn you down, or did you kind of say, I'm going to try and do this without even going down that road?
Well, at first, I did have an interest in doing a book with him. Um, it just from you know getting the story straight from Fernando would have been great.
Yeah.
I went through his people, and there wasn't a lot of interest. In fact, there was no interest, at least in the short term. Um, but from talking to some people that knew him, they're like, don't waste your time. This isn't something that he's going to be interested in. Um, you have to realize that Fernando has always been shy,
Yeah.
and he's avoided the media wherever he could. Um, and he's been lucky in the sense that he's had people to speak for him. During Fernandomania, and even in the years after that, it was Jaime Hurin,
Yeah.
who was his interpreter, and from Spanish to English. But even past the point where Fernando understood English, he still preferred Jaime Hurin to speak on his behalf. He had Tommy Lasorda, who never saw a camera that he didn't absolutely love, and so he took on that role. And there were others also, to a degree. Vin Scully was another one. Uh, so he's always had people to kind of speak for him.
Yeah.
So he was very lucky in that respect. But no, he wasn't interested in doing an autobiography. So I took it upon myself to write a book that was biographical, but with the bent on what his impact
Yeah.
was, not just to baseball but to society.
Well, and I think, and I mean this when I say it, I think that's why I enjoyed the book so much. I know Eric Nussbaum wrote a book called Stealing Home that kind of did a huge deep dive into the Chavez Ravine piece that sort of brought to light a story that, again, I would say people my age may not have been familiar with. And yet, what I loved is I think you touched on and tied that story into Fernando's story in a way that was significant. So, real quick, for people that don't know the Chavez Ravine story, you hinted at it. There's an area called Chavez Ravine, and Eric, you correct me if I'm wrong. I would say it's safe to say that nobody wanted to live in this place. The reason that a Mexican community moved in was because it was the only place they could afford. Is that fair?
Um, for the most part, yes.
Yeah.
I mean, you're talking the 1950s. Now, you had second and third generation Mexican families that were living there, Mexican American families. It was not it certainly wasn't an affluent
Yeah.
part of Los Angeles, but it was a solid community. It was made up of three neighborhoods, and it was joyous. They got along. They grew their own food. I mean, like, this was made up mostly of farmers,
Yeah.
and they were happy there. And to what you were saying, it's true. There weren't a whole lot of options in the city of Los Angeles where they could move to, which is one of the reasons why some of them didn't want to move. Um, Not only for the fact that they liked living there and their friends lived there and their relatives lived there, but the city was offering them, in a lot of cases, 50 cents on the dollar for what their homes were worth.
Yeah.
So some of the ones that remained, it wasn't because they didn't want to see a ballpark, but it was because they felt like they were being marginalized and ripped off. And they wanted fair value for what their home was worth. So, they didn't want to take 7,000 if their property was worth 15,000. But the horrifying thing about it was, I mean, some of them were literally dragged from their homes. Families of uh, U.S. veterans, and watched as their homes got bulldozed to the ground. So kind of the original sin
Yeah.
of Dodger Stadium. And so I guess it's the price of a new glistening ballpark. I mean,
Yeah.
Dodger Stadium, it's one of the top 2 or 3 most gorgeous stadiums in all of sports, in my opinion.
Yeah, and it's such a tragic story again because it's tragic when you hear that these people were forcibly removed. You were being polite about it. I mean, these people got screwed by the government financially. On top, not only did they say you have to move, but we're not even going to give you what your house is worth. But there was like this extra layer of tragedy to me that the only reason these people were in this place to begin with was because it was the only place they could afford. And so it's marginalization on top of marginalization on top of marginalization. And yet the reason that I keep saying I love that you connected this to Fernando is because you understand that before Fernando Valenzuela, as you pointed out, the Latino population in Los Angeles at best was apathetic towards the Dodgers and at worst despised them because this story had been told. It was widely reported that these 1,800 families had been removed, that people, like you said, had to watch their homes be bulldozed right in front of them. And yet, in that same place, 25, 30 years later, you have one of the most famous Mexican athletes to ever play American sports who rises to fame in that story. That is like, this is, if you presented this as a movie script, Eric, people wouldn't believe it.
Yeah, and the crazy thing about it is, the Dodgers. Yeah, to be fair, Los Angeles was the ultimate Plan B
Yeah.
for the O'Malleys. It really was. They wanted to stay in Brooklyn. They wanted the city of New York to build them a bigger stadium to compete. Ebbets Field in Brooklyn, the capacity was 28,000. They were up against the Yankees, who in the first of 3 Yankee stadiums had seating capacity of well over 60,000. You had the Polo Grounds, I think it was around 50 or 60,000. Municipal Stadium in Cleveland was 80,000. Those old ballparks were huge. And the Dodgers, even though they sold out a lot of games, I mean, they were a terrific team in the 50s. They weren't going, they, their revenue stream wasn't making it viable for them to stay there. They tried to move to Queens. The city planner, Robert Moses, he wasn't accommodating. So the city of Los Angeles is stuck with this 300-acre piece of property that they received through eminent domain a few years before. They didn't know what to do with it. I mean, so they lured the Dodgers out there. And so the Dodgers, they realized that in Southern California, with a growing Hispanic population, that was a population that they wanted to tap into
Yeah.
right from the beginning. That's why, even though there was this dissent against the Dodgers by the Hispanic community, they still, I mean, their second year in Los Angeles, they had a Spanish language radio broadcast.
Yeah.
They were waiting over 20 years for what they termed as the Mexican Sandy Koufax to come along,
Yeah.
and to bring in these fans. So when they did finally find the Mexican Sandy Koufax in Fernando, I mean, this 20-year-old kid from Sonora, Mexico, that they could easily relate to.
Yeah.
I mean, he looked. I mean, I can't tell you how many Latinos I spoke to, said, "Yeah, I have an uncle that looked just like him," or I had a cousin that looked just like him. He was like an everyman. He was anything but a physical specimen.
Yeah.
He was kind of pudgy with a bad haircut and not very athletic looking, but he's his start, the beginning of his career, was the greatest in the history of baseball for a starting pitcher.
Yeah.
8-0, 0.50 ERA. Made the cover of Sports Illustrated after 6 weeks of the 81 season. gets invited to the White House. I mean, he was the star of the show at a White House luncheon hosted by President Reagan. And he had all of 2.5 months of major league experience,
Yeah.
if you include late in the '80s season. So he just burst on the scene. It was organic. And Fernandomania just took off
Yeah.
right from opening day in 1981. And it just built on itself. And really, if you go to Dodger Stadium today, you'll see just as many Fernando jerseys as you will Mookie Betts or anybody else.
Yeah, and one of the anecdotes that are throughout here, people are going to need to read. But even just thinking about how that 1980 season, he comes up as a 19-year-old as a reliever, and it's 17 and 2/3 scoreless innings as a reliever, and that's before. And then it fast forward to 81, and again, if you know the big picture story of Fernando, you may forget these details, but it's 1981, and he's had this relief pitching appearance in 1980, and it's as I'm looking at everything that had to happen for him to start opening day, it's almost like, how did we not know, Erik, that something special was going to happen? Because you've got Jerry Royce, who's the Cy Young runner-up from the year before, their ace. He's got a late scratch. Bert Hooton, the number 2, had hangnail surgery. He's not available. Number 3 was recovering from a bone spur in his elbow. Number 4 and number 5 had just pitched, so they hadn't rested enough to be ready. And all of that paves the way for a 20-year-old Fernando Valenzuela to take the ball on opening day. And oh, by the way, his first start, 106 pitches, complete game, 5-hit shutout at age 20. And I mean, I was digging this up. Last year, there was not a single pitcher on an opening day roster under the age of 23 and a half last year. Fernando was 20, and he was starting opening day for the Los Angeles Dodgers and throws a 5-hit complete game shutout. And from there, you pointed out, the train is off and running, and there's no stopping it. You mentioned eight wins, 7 complete games. The only non-complete game in there was 9 innings. The game just hadn't ended yet. 0.5 ERA. By the way, he hit 360. I mean, the stats, like, even looking back, it's mind-blowing to me, Erik, to read this story and to read these numbers and to try and process how this could possibly be real.
Yeah, exactly. Like you said, it was his first big league start, and before the game, he's sleeping in the trainer's room. He's
Crazy.
totally relaxed.
Yeah.
I mean, you would think that a 20-year-old rookie, opening day, sold out stadium, that he'd be throwing up in the men's room or something like that. I mean, it would be normal, right? But instead, he was so relaxed, and that's just how he was. He, of course, you touched on the end of 1980, when they were chasing down the Houston Astros, or trying to, in that last weekend of the series, and it went to a 1-game playoff, 163rd game of the year. And I mean, everybody in that locker room, that Dodgers locker room, wanted Lasorda to go ahead and start Fernando.
Yeah.
They ended up going with Gultz instead, because Gultz was the veteran, high-priced free agent that they brought in that season. And Gultz didn't exactly have a good year. I think his ERA was in the high 4s or something like that. And everybody wanted Fernando to start because, it's 17 shutout innings in relief. And he had been a starter in the minor league, in the minor league. So,
Yeah.
I mean, he could do it. And of course, the Astros won that 1-game playoff. But it's interesting. Mark Langell, the Dodgers team historian, he believes that it was a blessing in disguise, because by not pitching Fernando in that huge 1-game playoff, it kind of kept Fernando in baseball's witness protection program. Over the winter, nobody knew who Fernando was yet. And so nobody could really prepare for him on the other side. And so maybe it helped. And of course, in 81, the Dodgers finally slayed that dragon after losing the World Series in 74 and 77 and 78. and losing the 1-game playoff in 1980. So world champions. So maybe it worked out for the best.
Yeah, and again, there's tons that I'm not going to ask about because I want people to read the book. But Fernando's story, his career plugs along. He makes 255, I believe, consecutive starts to begin his career. He throws 1,800 innings in his first 7 years, 96 complete games from 1981 to 1987. Didn't miss a start, 3.11 ERA. I mean, the stretch that he has, and he ends up being rewarded for it. 1988, he's the highest paid pitcher in the league. But that's kind of where things sort of take a left turn. It bottoms out in 1992. Again, I'm doing the fast forward version here, but 1992, rock bottom. He signs with the Tigers, is sold to the Mexican League, and is 0-5. So I'm imagining Eric Fernando at 0-5 in the Mexican League in 1992, wondering, how in the world does this turn around? But you fast forward in 1996, 1995, 1996, he has a resurgence with the San Diego Padres, 3.62 ERA in 1996 and 31 starts before finally retiring in 1997. As I kind of close out the career piece, and then I want to ask you about the off the field impact. Like you said this pretty openly. I wouldn't even say you hinted at it. Like the appreciation for Fernando's on-field contributions. Do you feel like people have the appropriate respect for the 7-year peak that he had at the beginning of his career? And I want to ask you after this about Tommy Lasorda and how much he is to blame for how Fernando's career played out in years 8 and beyond. But just big picture, he's not a Hall of Famer. You look at his numbers; it's hard to make just a purely statistical case for the Hall of Fame, I would say. But like, is there an appreciation for Fernando, the player, that maybe has gotten lost in history? Do you think?
Yeah, absolutely. I happen to think that he should have received far more Hall of Fame consideration than he did. The Hall of Fame, I was watching the broadcast the other day when they made the announcement, and uh, you know, a lot of what goes into inducting a player, it's not just numbers,
Totally.
but it's their impact on the game, it's their integrity. So when you combine all of that with Fernando, he probably does deserve to go in the Hall of Fame. You look at the career of Sandy Koufax. Koufax, had 5, maybe 6 extraordinary seasons. Same with Fernando. I mean, you can make the argument that Sandy, maybe in 4 out of 5 of those years, was more spectacular than Fernando, but not by much. And when you combine the impact that
Yeah.
Fernando had on millions, bringing Mexican Americans from outside the shadows, not just in Los Angeles, but around the country, in every ballpark that the Dodgers visited that year and beyond. I think as far as impact on the game, he's on the Mount Rushmore with Babe Ruth, Jackie Robinson, and Marvin Miller, in my opinion.
Yeah.
And I would argue that he brought more new fans to the game of baseball than even Babe Ruth himself.
Yeah. And
I
I think
really believe that. And
your
yeah,
book
go
makes a
ahead.
really compelling case for that, I think, which is what I appreciate is when you talk about the Hall of Fame and you even ask people, and some people, I think it's Jay Jaffe who's in there saying, hey, like, I would love to make the case, but statistically, this, and this. But the point is, if we're excluding people from the Hall of Fame because of negative impact that they may have on the sport of baseball, then why can't we apply that same thing to a guy like Fernando, who was very good, but also on top of very good, has had the dramatic impact that you're kind of referencing here.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, when I finished the manuscript, his number hadn't been retired. The announcement hadn't been made. And I'll tell you a funny story. Advanced copies of the book, they get sent out, and they get sent out to media, and so the Dodgers, they requested some books, um, for marketing efforts, probably. We put an ad in their yearbook, or the publisher did, and I had made an argument that Dodgers should retire his number based on everything that we just talked about. And about 3 weeks after those books were sent out, they made the announcement that they were retiring number 34. Now, I'm not going to take credit for it, but I mean, Fernando owes me a beer or something like that, because maybe, just maybe, that final chapter, legacy, that I
Yeah.
wrote in the book, just maybe that, if he was on the 1 yard line, maybe it pushed him across the goal line. Because the Dodgers, it was an unwritten rule that they did not retire numbers of non-Hall of Famers, with one exception, Junior Gilliam, who died prematurely at, I think, age 47 or 48. After being a beloved Dodgers player, he was a beloved Dodgers coach, and he died right before the 78 World Series. That was the only exception, and he was beloved by the O'Malleys. But the others had to be a Hall of Famer. And so my argument was everything we just talked about, his impact on the team, the sport, and society. And they retired his number, and they had a big 3-day extravaganza for Fernando. And so maybe my book helped a little bit. Who knows?
Well, and part of the argument against his Hall of Fame career is kind of how short the peak was, and how quick, how he had some performances and injuries and stuff that kind of derailed it after just 6 or 7 years. And there's hints of it, and Tommy Lasorda's involvement in that. Tommy Lasorda has the reputation as a guy who kind of overworked pitchers and blew out arms. And
Yep.
you've got a story in there in 1981. The Dodgers are not playing for anything. They have
Yeah.
clinched the playoff spot. There's nothing to play for. And in his
No.
last start of the season, Fernando's pitching on 3 days rest and throws like a complete game. And it's like, that is quintessential Tommy Lasorda. Now, you have other people in the book making the case, hey, Fernando's the type of guy, he wanted the ball, he didn't want to be taken out, et cetera, et cetera. How much blame do you put at the feet of Tommy Lasorda for the kind of what could have been for the second half of Fernando's career?
One big league manager who managed during that time said that he was Lasorda, that Fernando was Lasorted.
Yeah.
That was a common term that some of the other managers used to describe the overuse of pitchers by Lasorda. They were Lasorted. This was an age of Nolan Ryan, going 300 plus innings, and striking out all the guys that he did. And it was an era where starting pitchers didn't want to leave games. They wanted to complete what they started. But you've got a 20-year-old pitcher who, by the way, had pitched a ton of innings in the minor leagues and spring training and winter league ball, and leading up to that 81 season. And the thing was, Fernando was very good for business.
Yeah.
I mean, he was selling out every single game that he pitched. And so in a kind of a strange strike season where the fans had really turned on Major League Baseball in a big way. I mean, I remember it well. Attendance took a big hit, and these were meaningless games at Dodger Stadium. So Fernando was good for business, but I mean, to pitch him 9 innings like he was doing on 3 days rest, I think he did more than once that September. It was irresponsible.
Yeah.
And the innings that were being racked up year and year after year, combine that with the fact that Fernando's best pitch was a screwball.
Yeah.
And that is very taxing on the elbow. So you combine those factors, he was overused, and there's no doubt in my mind, and in the minds of a lot of the so-called experts that I talked to, that it ended his effectiveness prematurely. So, Lasorda could have spaced him out a little bit more, taken better care of him, especially a young pitcher with a screwball.
Yeah. I think Ken Gurnick had a long quote at the end of your book that I think is not the stance that I would take from afar in defending Tommy Lasorda. But and I apologize if it wasn't Gurnick, but whoever it was basically saying it's hard to push back against the way that he was used because the way that he was used was kind of what made him special. And I think there's probably something to that. Um, and yet again, I think we would have gotten the Fernandomania experience without, multiple starts on 3 days rest in September and meaningless baseball games as well. So Erik, let me close with this. There's a couple quotes on the impact that I wanted to share, and then I'll kind of give you the floor because I think this is the biggest takeaway for me. So, two quotes I'll share. Jaime Jarrín said, and you've referenced this, Fernando created more than any other baseball player new baseball fans because the people of Mexico, Central America, and South America didn't care much about baseball. And again, the gasoline on top of that is you didn't have just apathetic fans in Los Angeles, you had anti fans in Los Angeles. The second
Right.
quote, this from Jose de Jesus Ortiz, who was the first Latino president of the Baseball Writers Association of America. He said, I really do believe Fernando's significance in terms of what he did to give Mexicans a feeling of belonging and of telling Americans, quote, we're here, was remarkable. More than anyone, he brought Mexicans out of the shadows in the United States. I mean, those two quotes are
Yeah.
incredible and they're powerful.
Yeah.
And it's crazy to me that it's Fernando Valenzuela, this guy that is an incredible story and incredible. Nobody is going to ever forget about Jackie Robinson. And what Fernando had to deal with was not what Jackie had to deal with, but culturally, the impact that he made, it feels like is probably a lot closer than people give credit for.
Oh, absolutely. Fernando didn't have to go through uh, 99% of what Jackie Robinson did.
Yeah,
I mean, it was a different time, and but as far as impact, there's no doubt in my mind the impact was just as great.
yeah,
And I'm just glad that the Dodgers um, have celebrated that
yeah,
in the last year. I mean, they always did, but taking that big leap and retiring his number
yeah,
and giving him 3 days of celebration, it was just great to see. And um, I guess with the pandemic, maybe they were thinking about doing it back in 2021 and didn't. And they waited until last year. But I thank them for the timing
yeah.
because I came out with this book that kind of felt like a part of that celebration.
Yeah. One note that I was as I was preparing for this, that's kind of a sad note to me, but I believe heading into 2024 could be the first season since 2022 that the Dodgers don't currently have a Mexican player on the roster. Julio
Yeah.
Urias is gone. Victor Gonzalez traded away, and I was going back. Of course, this is a vague thing. There are no specific rules on who qualifies. Obviously, Austin Barnes still around playing for Team Mexico, but if you go back pre Julio Urias, you had Mexican American player like Adrian Gonzalez, Juan Castro, Nomar Garcia Parra, Oscar Robles,
Right.
Elmer Descens, Victor Alvarez. Those are all guys that were either Mexican American or born in Mexico, dating back to 2002. So 2024, as we currently sit here, Erik, unfortunately, in the legacy of Fernando, could potentially be the first Dodger season in 23 years without a Mexican born or Mexican American player.
Wow. Yeah. I mean, that's sad. Because the Mexican American fan base at Dodger Stadium is huge.
Yeah.
And I mean, I thought it was great. I mean, Urias, I mean, he really reminded me a lot of Fernando
Mm,
in terms of his look, his delivery. They're both southpaws. I mean, um, it was just tremendous to see. It was like, um, and and for Urias to be out there, when the celebration of Fernando was going on, I mean, it really warmed my heart. I
yeah.
mean, like, wow, this is great. And so it's tragic, the off field issues. It's just really sad because I mean, he's obviously a terrific pitcher.
Yeah. And the other piece, of course, as I'm reading this, I can't help but think about the Dodgers this year. I'm talking about how they have no Mexican-born or Mexican-American players this year, but they've got two of the most famous Japanese players in the world that are brand new. And so obviously in the legacy of Hideo Nomo and from Japan specifically, Chan-Ho Park in Korea. I mean, it's just crazy to like it's something that Dodger fans, I think, can wear as a badge of honor that they were, the team of Jackie Robinson, the team of Fernando Valenzuela, the team of Hideo Nomo, the team of Chan-Ho Park, like now Shohei Otani, Yoshinobu Yamamoto. Like it is a constant theme. And while the nationality is different, it's the same incredible story. It seems like being told over and over again in Dodger history.
Throughout their history, they're groundbreakers.
Yeah.
They really are. I mean, starting with Jackie Robinson, and even Glenn Burke, who I wrote my first book with him. I wrote his autobiography, and of course, things didn't go well for Glenn, the first homosexual ball player who came out. They traded him to Oakland. I mean, that's a whole other show. Um, but 2 years ago, they celebrated Glenn Burke with the night, and they had his family up, and of course, Glenn died of AIDS back in 1995. But the Dodgers have they've just made a tremendous effort to be understanding of different cultures and diversity, and it's really impressive. They lead the league in that category.
Yeah, and to be clear, as your book states, they're not perfect. The whole Chavez Ravine story, again, as you read the book, I think you do a great job of explaining the Dodgers' both involvement in the eminent domain piece and also the potential plausible deniability that they may have had in the process. But we're not here to say that the Dodgers are perfect. But Erik, you have been so generous with your time. Thank you.
Oh,
Again, folks, check out this book, Daybreak at Chavez Ravine. Available, came out last June. So it's available everywhere. And then, Erik, tell people where they can find you, your show, your website, social media, all of the above.
sure. Thank you. So I have a podcast. It's the Erik Sherman Show, and you can find it wherever you get your podcasts. You can follow me on Twitter. I am at by Erik Sherman. And you can check out my website at www.erikshermanbaseball.com, or on Facebook, Erik Sherman Baseball. And so that about does it, I think.
Awesome. Well, thank you again for your time, Erik. Thank you for this book. Again, as somebody that kind of was born and grew up in a post Fernandomania world, it was fun for me as a Dodgers fan to both understand the Chavez Ravine piece tied in with the Fernando piece that tracks all the way beyond just the 7-year kind of peak through the end of his career. And it was fun reading that last chapter about legacy, knowing how happy you must have been having written that chapter, knowing that, hey, you know what? Since you wrote that, it's happened. So thank you for everything, Erik. Best of luck. And again, folks, check out this book and check out Erik's other stuff. We appreciate you joining us
Thanks,
here
Jeff.
on Dodger Heads, presented by Dodger Blue. If you're new, subscribe, ring the notification bell. Like Erik said, we're also available, the Dodger Heads podcast on Apple, Spotify, and Google. Enjoy the rest of your day, folks. As always, go Dodgers.